Hello there! Today I am here to wrap up my book of Bonanza. By wrap up, I mean I'm going to be talking about the books that I haven't spoken about yet. Now I'll admit most of these didn't make the shortlist because my prediction tactics did not work this year. Well, to be fair, the Booker Prize kind of went down a different path with who they chose for their shortlist this year. If you want to know what I thought about that, then do watch the video, which I will link down below, in which I spoke about the shortlisted books which I'd already read at the time of the shortlist being announced. However, I still had a lot of the long list that I hadn't finished, and I wanted to carry on because I was really enjoying the challenge, and also, you know, I'm not good at not finishing things. So these may not be the most relevant reviews anymore, but we're going to go with it anyway. So I'm going to just kind of do flash reviews because, as I say, these aren't the most relevant reviews anymore. These books are no longer up for the Booker Prize, but alas. So the first one that I want to talk to you about is Gabriel Krauze's Who They Was. Now, I'm going to be completely honest, this was the second DNF off of the Booker pile for me, alongside This Mournable Body. I read about 50 pages of this and I just really didn't like it. It follows a gangster living in London and kind of the gangster life, and it's semi-autobiographical. The author himself was involved in gang. This is kind of an account of what happened to him. Now, I had the issue with this book that I often have with semi-autobiographical novels, in that I think when you are writing a novel that is so closely entwined with your life, you don't bother as much with the world building, and you also don't bother as much with the characterization, which was especially the problem in this for me. I just didn't feel that the character was built up at all. He was just a thug, and that would have been fine, but he wasn't even a believable thug. For example, a lot of this is written kind of gangster, you know, brethren and what's up my bruv and all of this kind of thing, and it's first person, so it's like that throughout. But then he'll come up with something like my mother and father, and it's like the language wasn't consistent, and even if it had been consistent, I don't think that I could have warmed to a novel that was written in that kind of language, because it reads as very juvenile to me. It just didn't click with me, and having read a few of the reviews, it doesn't really change in that respect, so I put this one to the side. It was not for me, I'm sorry. The first one I read was Redhead by the Side of the Road by Anne Tyler. I read this actually before the shortlist was announced because it's quite a short one and I flew through it, and I did read it really fast. It was my first Anne Tyler and it was okay. It was fine. I think for me this falls into the category of, there's a big thing in books at the moment, it seems, of having kind of outsiders who aren't very good at socialising and kind of live a quite isolated and sheltered life, and kind of finding their way out of that in a moment. Eleanor Oliphant being the most obvious one. A convenience store woman, I also found the same thing, and also there's that, I can't remember the title, Life and Times of Donna Creosote, I think, all along the same kind of lines, only this is about a man instead of a woman. All the others have been about women, and I think out of the sort of scope of those novels, this is the one that I enjoyed the most. I think the character in this was not unlikable, whereas the characters in all those other books that I mentioned I did find quite unlikable, and I found that their journey wasn't particularly there at all. This one was better than that, but it still kind of fell into that category, and I just kind of struggle to get behind those books at the moment, which is weird because I like the idea of this shy, awkward narrator, but they just kind of fall short for me. As I said, I think the main issue that I had with all those other books is that I didn't like the narrators. The Van in this is a more relatable and more sympathetic character, and I think he does go on slightly more of a journey. It was still slightly lacking for me, and I wouldn't say that this is a standout book. Predominantly we follow a man he's a self-employed computer tech person who lives by himself. He's got a relationship with a woman, but it's not really going anywhere, and he ends up spending some time with the child of one of his college friends, and it makes him, you know, realise what's wrong with his life, etc. It was fine, as I say, not that memorable for me. Then I read How Much of These Hills Is Gold by Pam Zhang. Now, I'm not gonna lie, from looking at the long list, this was one that I was really excited to get to, and I thought I was absolutely gonna love it, to the point where I was in no rush to get to it because I thought it was a sure bet that I was going to enjoy it, and I didn't really. I think the main problem that I had with this novel is that it has a very large scope, but it's a very short book, so it kind of doesn't have the depth that you would like of it. It's like a shallow pond rather than a deep pool that I think it needed to be. This is about, it's set in the Wild West, and in the gold rush, and it follows a pair of girls whose parents have died, and they are trying to find their place in the world basically, and they are sort of living in the wilderness when we meet them. and then we flash back to when their parents were alive, and we also look at them in the future and where they come after trying to cope alone in the wilderness in this gold rush period. I like the gold rush period as a setting, and I like the Wild West as a setting. I think they are rich and deep, but as I say, this book is not rich and deep. It kind of just skims the surface, and I think because it kind of has 3 different parts. It has the beginning where we meet them in the present, then we go back in the past, and then we're in the future. And it doesn't really have the time or the scope or the page count to explore any of those topics properly. All we end up with is this really brief look at these different periods in these girls' lives, which doesn't really add up to explaining their characters or who they are or what they want or where they're going. And also we don't really get any explanation as to how they got where they are in the future either. I just think this is a really rushed reading book in the end. I think it needed so much more. Like, it feels like it needs to be an epic story, and it's just not. There are still interesting things about this. The writing is quite sparse and simplistic, which isn't a bad thing. I quite like a simple, sparse narrative. But yeah, I just think it needed to be way longer, and it needed to look at much more depth about what was happening to these girls, and also just the period in general. The Gold Rush period, I think, is a really interesting time in history, and obviously the Wild West has a lot to describe about it, and the nature and the landscape, and we just don't get that. And so ultimately this was, I think I gave it 3 stars in the end. It was really mediocre for me, and I found that I was having to force myself to get to it because I just wasn't invested in these girls' lives. So yeah, there was interest in here, and I think it had real potential, but ultimately it didn't live up to that for me. It does get better, I promise. We're on to the good books now. We're on to the ones that I actually enjoyed. So I've got Colum McCann's Apeirogon. I think that's how you say that. Now I'm going to do a disclaimer here. I wanted to not like this book because it's kind of been hidden under the surface. I couldn't actually find any news about it. I found out about this on Instagram. But Colum McCann has been sort of named in quite a few sexual assault cases, especially with Roxane Gay. Roxane Gay has publicly on Twitter come out and said that she will not be supporting his novels because her friend was involved in one of these sex scandals. And I think, given that the Booker Prize this year is really focusing on more diverse and predominantly female-led, to be honest, books, I feel like it's a bit of a dud point that they've put this in here. I don't know whether they were aware of the issues, because, as I say, I couldn't find them in the news or anything like that. It was only on social media that I came across these problems. So for that reason alone, I can't recommend this book, and I don't think it should have been on the long list, let alone the short list. However, as a book, separating it from the author, which I think is always a difficult thing to do, as a book, I really enjoyed this. Another criticism that I've heard of this is that it should have been written by an own voices writer, which again, given that the long list was very diverse this year and there were a lot of own voice authors on there, again, I don't disagree with that point. However, I think it's difficult because when you're saying that own voices people should have, obviously own voices people should be able to tell their own stories, but at the same time I think it's important to admit that we live in a world where white male voices are heard more, and I think it's better for them to be talking about diverse subjects than to not cover them at all. So it's a funny one in my head. I don't know, obviously it would be better if this was an own voices book, but it's not, and I think it is done well, and there is a lot of research into this, so take from that what you will. So this is a book basically that's set in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and we look at the issue from 2 different male perspectives, one on the Israel side, one on the Palestine side. Both of them have lost daughters in the conflict, and both of them actually are more sympathetic to the other side, which I think is really interesting because it makes for a very broad story, and it makes for a very fair, I think, opinion on both of the issues involved. It's just a beautifully written book. I think it's a book that makes a kind of issue that a lot of people maybe would avoid looking into or researching. It makes that issue quite easy to relate to and quite understandable, and is, as I say, it does look quite fairly at both sides of the point. At points I thought it was a bit biased one way and I wasn't sure about that, but actually once we get into the story it very much switches. We get completely look at both sides. The one thing that I do think about this story is that it's written in these little numbered sections. Let me find some. See, now I'm not going to be able to find them. It's written in like numbered little paragraphs, and they are really quite small at times. And we get all sorts in there. So we get the main 2 male narratives, and we also get random facts about birds and the migration of birds. We get random facts about Israel and the formation of Israel. We get random facts about all sorts of things. And I think there's something about this idea of writing a novel in this way that we kind of feel is very literary and accomplished, but actually reading this, it's a beautiful novel. There is no denying that it's a beautiful novel, and the writing is astounding at points, and it really is a novel that stuck with me, and I want to revisit it, and I think it's, yeah, it stuck with me a lot. However, I think doing it in these choppy little paragraphs is kind of a cheat, and I say that as a writer because I think, for me personally anyway, the hardest thing about writing is the joiner parts, the parts where you join one part of the narrative to the next. And by doing it in these choppy little bits, you don't have to do that. You don't really have to build the narrative, because you just kind of write those key scenes that come to you. And I think every author has that. When they have an idea for a novel, they get key scenes in their head. He just had to write the key scenes, so it's kind of a cheat, but I would still say it's an accomplished novel. Can I recommend it? No, because I think Colum McCann is too much of a controversial figure at the moment for me to completely get behind him, and I certainly won't be searching out any more of his books. However, as a standalone thing, I did enjoy this, I have to say. I can't help it. Sorry. So then I read The Beast That Is The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. Obviously this is the third in the Thomas Cromwell trilogy and has been long awaited, and it is a very big book. I think it's over 800 pages, nearly 900 pages long, and it took me quite a while to get through. Now I'm going to say from the off, I was surprised to not see this on the shortlist. I think certainly when you compare the writing in this book to some of the books that have been shortlisted, it's not even a competition. This is Hilary Mantel. I mean, she's at the top of her game. However, I think they were looking for very different things in the shortlist this year, and I think it's not a bad thing that more well-known authors haven't been included. As a work of literature, I think this probably deserved to be there, but equally I think it's really nice that lesser-known authors have been given that platform. I would say that this was probably my favourite of the Thomas Cromwell books. I don't really think I need to explain what they're about. They follow Thomas Cromwell, who was the advisor of Henry VIII, and this is kind of the book that looks at his downfall and how that happens. A lot happens in this book. However, I do think it's probably too long. I mean, these books are interesting because they are phenomenally written, but I don't think they're for everyone, because they very much focus on the conversations that Thomas Cromwell has with the people in court and with Henry himself. And it's an interesting way to write a book, and at times it does get quite tedious because there are so many conversations and there are so many characters. But I think the ending of this book alone, and I've seen mixed things about the ending. I thought the ending was just phenomenal. Up to that point I was like, it's maybe a 4-star, but the ending just absolutely topped the others for me and gave it an instant 5 stars and put it at the top of the trilogy in my opinion. As I say, I do think it's too long and there are a lot of conversation. I mean, as you can imagine, that's a lot of conversations. But it was fun and it was enjoyable, and these books, they are dense. They're not easy reads at all, but I think if you're willing to give them that little bit of effort and put the time in, absolutely worth it. Then finally, we've got a bit of a left field one for me actually, which is Love and Other Thought Experiments by Sophie Ward. I couldn't get a grip on this when I was just looking at the description. It sounded like a short story collection. I wasn't really that bothered about diving into it. It didn't sound that interesting to me. However, I really enjoyed this. So Sophie Ward is an actress. I actually didn't know this. I saw her the other day on Between the Covers, which by the way is on BBC Two and is an amazing book programme if you're in the market for one. And she was talking about this. Basically, this is a philosophical book, but it's not unreachable at all. It looks effectively at thought experiments from philosophers in history and across time. And basically, thought experiments are kind of theories that philosophers use to test their ideas and to test theories, basically. And she's taken some famous thought experiments like Schrodinger's cat and things like that, and others that aren't so well known, and she has basically written stories about each of those theories. But within those stories, and this is why I suppose it can't be called a short story collection even though it's presented in a series of different short stories, within those theories she's looking at one family in particular. We start joining them when we find out that 2 women are trying to have a baby, and the woman that is pregnant has also got cancer. and we follow what happens to them, what happens to the child that they have, and what happens to him way into the future. And it's just really, really interesting. So we look at this in the present day, we look at alternate worlds, we look at the past and how these people have come to be in these places at the time, and it's just a fantastic and easy to reach philosophy book. It's probably the easiest book that looks at subjects like these that I've ever read, and I would highly recommend it. I really enjoyed it. It was really surprising to me, and as I say, it's short stories, but in a way that it is ultimately one overall novel, and they are all not just connected, but they are all literally following the same kind of narrative ultimately. And yeah, I just thought it was glorious, and I would highly recommend this. I'd say this has probably been the big surprise for me off of the books that I had left. I really didn't expect to enjoy it, and I thoroughly did. So those are all the books of the Booker long list read, apart from the 2 that are DNF'd, and I'm not going to give myself a hard time about them because I just genuinely knew that I wouldn't enjoy them, and there's no point reading things that you're not going to enjoy. Please let me know what you have thought of the long listed and shortlisted books this year, in anticipation of the winner being announced later this week. I think I'll have to check that. I am going to do a video talking about my thoughts on the winner and my thoughts overall on what I've learned from doing this and how I've enjoyed it. Do look out for that if you're interested, and check out the playlist, which I will link somewhere, if you want to see more of these videos, and I will see you next time. Bye.